Hello, I'm Pete Lyden. I'm the founder of Reinvent, the media company driving these conversations on the future of work. And we're here with Lenny Mendonca, who is the new chair of New America, a think tank, Washington-based think tank, thinking through the next generation big changes to the country and the economy, but also a longtime senior partner at McKinsey. Great to have you here.
Thank you. My pleasure, Pete.
So we're trying to tap into people's sense of how unusual this moment is, or where we are in the kind of historical moment at some level. Like, to what extent, with the evolution of global economy and where our technologies are going, and for that matter, the politics overlay of that, how do you think about the time we're in right now?
So I think we are in a transition both economically and politically that is of the magnitude and scale of what happened a couple times in history, but the one that I'm closest to was in historic terms, was the Industrial Revolution and what coincided with it of the progressive movement. And at the turn of the 20th century, it was those two corresponding times were extremely important, not just for economy and corporations, but for the entire political system, our governance, the disruption that's happening in how people feel about how the country's working. So I think we're in that kind of moment again. So that's the closest I can think of.
So say a little bit more about that parallel, particularly the progressive era parallel, because people have used this industrial revolution, a different kind of
Sure.
industrial change, but why the progressive era period?
So it was a time where a lot of the institutions that were in place, and including the political parties, the education system, our view about rights and voting, view about workforce rules, were not attuned with the nature of what was happening in the economy. It was also really big divisions within the parties. So remember, this was an era that's most closely remembered with Teddy Roosevelt, was also a governor of California at that time, who were part of a group of people who redesigned a whole set of political institutions that really changed the way that we are governed. So it led to things like the allowing women to vote. It changed the way senators are elected. It created the opportunity, first in Oregon, to have the initiative process be part of how we govern ourselves. It was really fundamental changes in the politics and policies and governance of the country that were necessary to align with a whole set of changes that were happening in the industrial sectors.
So when you then put that kind of lens on today, what are you most concerned with? What are the challenges that you see we're kind of up against in that same framework?
So the biggest thing I'm worried about is not, are we going to go through an era where robots are going to eat all our jobs and there's not going to be work in the future. I'm not worried about that in a longer term sense. I'm worried about the transition, and I'm most importantly worried about, will our political institutions and our institutions more broadly, including education institutions, be up to the scale and pace of the challenge? I mean, we can see a transition that's occurring. It's a little bit like climate change was 15 years ago. The leading edge scientists understood what was going on. It was sort of in the public political dialogue, but not really. I'm talking about in the United States. Mm-hmm. And we just said, it's something that's a long ways away, we'll fix it later. And that's not what is going to happen here. We can't let that happen in the same way that we were reacted too late to climate change, and it can't happen that we're acting too late as it relates to the transition of the economy. And so I think what's got to happen is we need that same scale of thinking about all those kinds of institutions that really reinvented themselves, not from the inside, but from the outside during the progressive movement. We need to do that today to all kinds of institutions, from the way we elect people to our higher education and public higher education institutions, to how we think about our responsibility of the social safety net. Those types of things need the same kind of fundamental rethinking that we had in that era.
And how, that's a really terrific frame. How prevalent do you think that recognition is out there, or do you think?
I think we are, that's, as I said, in terms of analogy, I think it's where we were with climate change 15 years ago. Leading edge scientists and people at the cutting edge of where the policy was going were thinking and talking about it a lot, but we weren't really doing anything about it yet. And what happened at that time, for example, in the governor of California, who was Arnold Schwarzenegger, who also was in a political tumult in California at that time, said, so I'm going to issue an executive order on climate change that asserted that we were going to have dramatic targets for reduction of our climate change carbon footprint over the course of specific targets in 5 years and 10 years and 20 years. At that time, we had no idea how we were going to get there. There was no institutional mechanism to accomplish them. There was no regulation. We just said, we're going to do this. A year later, the legislature passed it, and then it was reaffirmed and upped in this last session. You know, we need that same kind of boldness and thinking on these types of issues to get ourselves quite a bit ahead of, we don't know all the solutions, but we need to acknowledge that it's a challenge and set ourselves some aggressive goals to try and get there, and then figure out how we change everything to align around it.
I love that. So just to kind of frame a little bit more of the challenge as well, so there's this kind of rise of automation and AI you've kind of alluded to. There's also this, which is something we've been looking at closely, is this atomization of the economy, increasing numbers of independent workers, the rise of the platform economy, which is shifting the way the economy works. How much do you think about those developments as part of this thing too?
Very much a part of it. That's what part of what I was talking about when I said we have to reinvent the safety net to respond to that. Safety net has historically in the United States been tied to specific employment under the assumption that that was going to be where you were going to be for your life, whether it was your health care, your retirement, provision of training. It was that's just how it happens. That's not the way it happens today, let alone the way it's going to be in the future. And so we need to think about decoupling those things. We started to do it with healthcare a little bit with the Affordable Care Act, so it can be portable. 401ks are in concept an ability to do that, although they're mostly utilized by the wealthy. Social Security is something that's like that. I think there's a lot more that can be done in a whole other range of benefits, including sick days, including vacation, including training accounts. I think there's a lot more to think about. Is your ability to navigate that transition, where there's going to be a lot of movement, tied to you, or is it tied to your company? And I think those are important discussions that we need to have that reimagine what that can be.
But when you think of this general rise of the platform economy, tech-driven kind of transition, beyond the AI and robotics side, do you generally see that as a positive thing? We're sitting here in the middle of California, San Francisco here, or do you see it as problematic of the scale and the size of some of these companies?
No, you asked two different questions.
Okay.
Question around, I think the general movement towards platforms disaggregation, creating the opportunity for independent workers is a good thing. Yeah. Yes, I think that's a good thing. I think it removes friction in the labor markets. It creates opportunities for people to work on their terms and their hours. It creates opportunities for people to supplement their income. It creates opportunities for much more flexibility in how things are met geographically as well. I think that is generally good. What is not good is that some of those models are built on arbitraging the old social safety net. So if you had a system by which your benefits and your assessment of what you were entitled to went with you, not the company, and it was some sort of shared responsibility between you and the company in terms of how you pay into it, I'd worry about it a lot less. Today, I'm really excited for innovators who operate in that world. I'm not excited if their entire business model is built on regulatory arbitrage from the old social safety net.
Totally got that. So you're now the chair of a vital think tank here. So we're trying to look at the most promising kind of solutions or ways forward. And so given these issues we just kind of have briefly roughed out there, what are you most kind of excited by, or what do you see as some of the more promising ways forward? You talked about a portable safety net and things,
right.
But other thoughts about what are the things that seem to be best? And also, we're also kind of interested in places that you think we need more work in, essentially more development, more research, even more kind of, let's go back to the drawing board.
So let me start with a basic belief. This is a personal belief. I'm not speaking on behalf of any institution. I don't believe these solutions are going to come in from Washington, D.C. anytime soon. I don't think the political process is lending itself to forward thinking, and I also think the kinds of solutions we're going to need don't lend themselves to someone sitting in a room coming up with a solution, writing a law that never changes. So I think what we're going to need is much more room for policy flexibility and be able to experiment more about what might be working around the country. And then when we understand what's working, have that scale and perhaps be law nationally. So on the benefits issue that we were talking about, I really don't believe the answer to that is something that goes through Congress. I think what we need is some safe harbor time for people to experiment in different geographies with what might work. So that, as a fundamental level, that's what I think the opportunity is. Things that I think are promising are mostly things in that mindset that aren't happening in Washington, but are happening in smaller scale around the country. So on that one, there's some interesting things that's happening with in New York City in terms of Black Car Fund being expanded to other benefit opportunities. I think there are some interesting things that are being talked about and in process in both Seattle and in parts of California that create mechanisms to do something similar. I think there are a lot more opportunity to do those kinds of experimentation if people thought it was possible and could try it. I'm also excited about things that are opportunities to help workers transition and improve their skills and job prospects that are allowing them to still work at the same time, whether that's apprentice programs or whether that is disaggregated certificates and things, or something more substantial like the competency-based online university that's Western Governors University. So there are pockets of things that are pretty interesting. Western Governors, which no one has ever heard of, I'm sure is going to have 100,000 students this year. And it is competency-based online. People still work at the time they're getting their degree in in-demand fields. It takes on average 3 years for them to get a degree. It costs $6,000 a year, including free textbooks and a mentor. And on average, people make back the cost of their education within 18 months. We need a lot more of that kind of activity, and we need it at scale.
We're sitting in California. You're also related to California Forward,
Yes.
kind of a California-based think tank, I guess you'd think of it.
Reform organization.
To what extent do you think California, with the size of its economy and all the tech companies and all that we have here, to what extent do you think California could model a lot of these ways forward?
I think that's a great question. So California Forward has been around for a decade. It's a government reform organization that was established to help think about how does California reform how it operates and make it work better, both politically and economically. And I do think that California has the opportunity and the way that we have been positioning ourselves, actually the obligation to prove a model that works. If we're at the forefront of technological innovation, if we're the home of Hollywood media and entertainment and gaming industry, if we're the home of agriculture, food and wine, if we are a place where we're casting ourselves as the resistance and the alternative to the model of what's going on in Washington, we damn well better make sure it works. And so trying to find an opportunity here where we have all the advantages and the first application of a lot of the technologies that are being developed, but we actually have a governance system, a safety net, a distribution of the gains from that really work is essential. I think we have a long ways to go to accomplish that. California is big and complex in and of itself. It's the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world, depending on the exchange rates. If California were an independent country and divided into 6 pieces, we would have the richest state in the country in the Bay Area and the poorest state in the country in the Central Valley. We have extremely wide differences in terms of how people are participating in these gains, and we need to work on that stuff. We need to set a standard for innovation, but innovation that works for everyone.
Where do you think we need, so this is kind of related to the thing that we haven't really explored as much, is where do we need a lot more work? And,
Sure.
and you've kind of alluded to it there through
Sure.
California, but if you wanted like researchers or people to like think tanks, whatever, kind of what do we really got to figure out pretty quickly, or where would you go?
So the biggest thing that I'm worried about is not technology or the development of jobs and opportunities in the future. I'm worried about how do we make that transition, and I'm worried about what's the distribution of the gains that happen from that transition. And I think there's a lot more research that needs to be done on those areas. It's both about what's working, but it's also a imaginative process about take yourself back, and you're the progressive reformers at the end of the 20th century, and you're facing all of this. What would you do? How would you reimagine our institutions? Antitrust was invented that environment. Is antitrust relevant for today's environment? I don't think things that were invented 120 years ago probably stand the test of time. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to have those kinds of thinking, I'm saying it broadly on purpose. I don't think it's a narrow task. It's about how do we ensure that our institutions, our law, our governing mechanisms, institutions are actually aligned with where the economy is going, not with where we are now.
So the last few questions as we're thinking about here, we're just thinking about like the role. You talked about the role of California, mm-hmm. potentially taking a leadership role. What do you think the role is of the tech companies or some of the leading companies of our economy to kind of help drive this change, take on maybe some magnanimous gestures, some kind of different ways that shifts this thinking in a way?
So I think there is an important opportunity for technology companies and their leaders to not separate the innovation that they're creating from how that influences society. So I think the bulk of what they need to be spending their time on in a hyper-competitive industry is making sure they're continuing to be ahead on the technological front. But I do think there is an important obligation to be part of the conversation about what are the implications of that technology on society, and how do we make society work not just for the people who have the privilege and opportunity, but for all of society. And I do think many of the technology companies have gone from zero to huge and have decided at a little bit late that they're actually an entity that has public implications and need to be involved in public policy and government. I think that's not surprising given how young they are, but I do think they're now increasingly understanding that if you're going to succeed and have that kind of scale of growth, you need to think ahead of that equation and be engaged. I think that is not about just near-term business lobbying and regulatory things that align with your economic interests. I think it's about being part of the broader conversation around how do we ensure that this transition that we're talking about can be successful. I want the CEOs of those companies to be fantastic business leaders, but I want them to be statespeople at the same time. This is not a historical anomaly in that sense. There were many business leaders coming out of World War II who drove the transition of the U.S. economy from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy. They helped create the Marshall Plan. They helped in different regional places around the country, including the Bay Area, create really lasting thinking and institutions about how you make the transition from a wartime to a peacetime economy. In the Bay Area, the governor at that time, Earl Warren, later the head of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and business leaders in the Bay Area got together and said, we have all this huge armament that was built here to supply the Pacific Fleet. We might want to figure out together how, when that stops, the economy doesn't tank. Mm-hmm. And so they created a whole set of institutions that included BART. It actually, not very many people know this, but the Kaiser Permanente is the last element of the Kaiser families that were a whole set of industrial companies that were at that time. The reason Kaiser Permanente was built was because the Kaiser companies believed that they needed to keep their workers healthy and on the job, and they allowed other companies to be members in that organization so that their workers were healthy, so that they could go build the ships every day. Okay. And now that's the institution that's left. So I use those as examples to say, this may feel completely foreign and we've never done it before, but we need business leaders to step up to that scale of aspiration, that scale of engagement, that scale of optimism, and that scale of leadership. Otherwise, they're going to be seen as part of the problem, not part of the answer.
Well, you kind of pointed out the two historical moments where the big tech companies of that progressive era, or the kind of Gilded Age, you could say, were pretty much demonized in many respects, broken up, all the different things with the backlash there. And then again, in World War II, very different kind of leadership. So there is kind of a juncture here. But you hang out. I mean, you know, you've been out here many years. You know a lot of these folks. How confident are you that the kind of folks in these companies will actually want to do the right thing and want to move in these directions?
So if you take the most optimistic view about what leadership was like post-World War II, it wasn't every CEO. There was a group of them who, both in local communities and nationally, took it upon themselves to lead and to be role models. And so I think that's what we need here. And I'm not pessimistic about that. There are people who are doing that. They need to be celebrated for it. We need to recognize that everything they do isn't going to be right, and they're going to make mistakes and learn along the way. But we need them to be talked about as public leaders and assume that role not just because they're creating great technology or creating shareholder value. I think there was a rich history in this part of the country through Hewlett and Packard individually, their companies, and many of the companies and individuals that spun out of that were part of that history in this part of the Bay Area. And I think much of that still lives. I also think there are other newer leaders, Mark Benioff of Salesforce as one example, who totally understand their role and are engaged in an aggressive way. I think we need more of them. You don't all need to wait until you're a billionaire to be able to do that. I think there are enormous number of people who join companies and stay with them because they feel the mission and accomplishment. It's actually a good idea from a business standpoint as well. So I'm not Pollyannish about it, but I do think there will be people who step up.
Well, that's a good time to end what has been a fascinating conversation. So thanks for sharing your ideas, and it's great to have this conversation.
Enjoyed it. Thank you.